Welcome back to the Whiskey Exchange YouTube channel. My name is Jason Vaswani. I am the head buyer of Old and Rare Spirits here at the Whiskey Exchange. And in this video today, we're going to cover the topic of vintages when it comes to collecting whiskey. Now, the term vintages might sound quite a scary area to cover, especially if you're new into whiskey. And all I'm going to say from the beginning, don't stress too much. This is just something more for the intermediate and the advanced drinkers, but something that you can keep an eye out for, especially when you're building your collection, when you're going for some of those more unique single cask bottlings. But let me explain what are vintages. So vintages, or golden eras in production, are when you look back at different distilleries and you look at certain eras in production where the liquid was just considered some of the best. And the way in which you can tell this sometimes is by checking their scores online to see if they scored very highly. One thing as well you can do is if you taste different liquids, like one of my favorites over here is this Glenburgie. It's one of my personal favorites in the sort of modern era, but I'll get to that in another video. Looking at previous vintages and other distilleries, one thing that I get to do, and I'm quite lucky to do here at the Whiskey Exchange, is do tastings and masterclasses at our whiskey shows. And you can pretty much understand the history of certain distilleries through tasting certain expressions. One of the ones I covered last year was the Bowmore 1968 32-year-old. And Bowmore from that era specifically has a very tropical, fruity profile in that 60s character. Then in the 70s, it's there for a little period of time, and the 80s, it completely changes. And this is due to production changes. And in the 90s, again, completely different. And 2000s, something, again, it changed again. But it's quite interesting to see and learn what these flavor differences are, because when you're collecting, you want to make sure you have a collection with a nice variety of different things. Now, some of the vintages can get very pricey, so that's why I would say if you're a beginner, you're starting out, don't stress too much about it, because we'll cover that in the next video. But if you missed the last video where we spoke about lost distilleries, I'll say do check that one out first and then come back to this one, because even when we talk about lost distilleries, they're distilleries that you're never going to be able to taste again unless you're able to find one of those independently bottles or one of those bottles of whiskey. But seeing the differences in production, say for example a Port Ellen in the 1960s, late 60s, you'll see a completely different style to something towards the end of the 1970s or early 80s before its closure. And so it's something that's quite interesting when you explore vintages. Now, you can go even further in depth if you want to look at specific years, but I'd say that's more, we can probably cover that later on down the line. But for me, I think the most important thing is understanding what are good in terms of good drinking vintages and good collecting vintages. And I always say the best way to do it is to explore and develop your palate and taste them. So if you do find yourself at one of our shows, do check out some of our Old and Rare stands, because we do open a lot of these different vintages, and I try to go for always my favorites. I think it's always the best thing. Go for the best and just to share it with everyone to make sure everyone can understand them. Or even at our masterclasses this year or in the coming years, we're going to have some very exciting stuff coming soon. So that's about it for vintages. It's about finding those golden eras in production where liquid was completely different to what it is today. And like I said with Bowmore, tropical fruits from the 60s, and that certainly changed when you found it in the 70s and the 80s, went to a different, almost like a floral style. So it's finding what works for your palate. And like I mentioned, even in the first video, when it comes to collecting whiskey, it's about finding what really works for your palate, because at the end of the day, you've got to sit there and drink it. And I always say when you have a collection, and this is what my personal collection, I also mention this a lot to my friends. When you've got a collection, if you've got stuff you enjoy, it's great. If you've got a collection where you've got things where you just bought them, if you have to eventually drink them, you're not going to be happy. So always buy things that work for your palate and that you're going to enjoy, and it just makes it that much more enjoyable. Now, another thing I want to cover, which is actually modern classics, which are vintages from the current era. We're going to cover that in the next video, where I'm going to go into a bit of detail about some of the new things that I think are really something to look out for. And one of them is just sitting over here, which I would always recommend to everyone, which is a Glenburgie, but we'll keep that for the next video. But anyway, that's it for vintages. I hope you enjoyed. I'll see you in the next video.